Hi, my name is Bonnie. I am the owner of Genesis Photography. I've been a photographer in Lincoln for 8.5 years now, and I have tried a whole lot of different locations throughout the Lincoln area for photo shoots. And so I've kind of amassed this list of different locations, my 8 best locations that I would recommend to do your family photos. And of course, you can apply these locations to things outside of family photography. I personally do family, newborn, kids, and maternity for my business, and I use these obviously for maternity and family and kids as well. But people can use these for wedding photos, for seniors, whatever type of photography that you shoot. Most of this stuff will apply to you as well. So what I'm going to be covering for those locations is the pros, the cons, and then my recommended times to shoot at these spots. It's certainly not the only time that you can, but based on my experience and what I found from those locations, I have a couple of recommended times to do it. On top of that, I'm also going to be showing some footage of the locations themselves, but then also photos that I've taken at those locations so you can get a better idea of what to expect from your own photos with whoever you shoot with. This is a lot of information, so I've actually created a PDF spreadsheet. I'll link it in the bottom to my blog post where you can download this PDF that summarizes most of the stuff I'm going to cover. And as we're going through the video, absolutely feel free to skip over the ones that you're not interested in, or if you're specifically interested in one or two of these, just skip through the video and find the information for those specific spots. I do want to make one caveat in that I can't speak for all photographers. There are some photographers that don't have flexibility in the locations that they shoot at, and they don't really let clients have a say because they've kind of chosen their spots for specific reasons. So make sure that you're verifying with the photographer you're interested in that you have this ability to choose a spot or coordinate on a spot before you end up, moving forward and booking a session and paying the deposit and everything. Okay, I'm going to show you a quick map of the rough location for these spots and tell you which ones we're covering, and then we'll get started. Okay, this is a map of the Lincoln area and a rough idea of where each spot that I'm going to be talking about is. So in the order that I'm going to talk about them, number 1 is Pioneers Park. Number 2 is the UNL Downtown campus. Number 3 is the Capitol building. Number 4 is Holmes Lake Park. Number 5 is the Frank Shoemaker Park. Number 6 is Wilderness Park. Number 7 is the Sunken Gardens. And number 8 is the Haymarket and Railyard area. Let's get started. Okay, let's kick things off with Pioneers Park. This is a park that most people in and around Lincoln are familiar with. And I'm specifically going to be talking about the east side of Pioneers Park because that's my favorite place to shoot at, but the park itself is huge and there are many other places in the park that you can use, but for reference, that's the part that I'm going to be talking about. Pioneers Park, one of the pros that it has is that it has a ton of different backdrops. And by backdrops, I mean, a differentiation of what you're going to see in the background when you take the photos. I think that as far as unobstructed backdrops without having to worry about parking lots or, tight spaces or anything, I think Pioneers Park has the best overall scenery in town, especially when you get to the spring and the fall seasons. I think it's just really, really beautiful. Some really beautiful flowering trees and then great fall leaves as well. And then there's just, it's just so expansive that it just lends itself to really great scenery. My last pro to talk about with Pioneers Park, and this is a huge one, is that they've got a large amount of evergreens. And again, I'm speaking for the east side of the park. I can't speak for the rest of it, but tons of evergreens. Really the only place in town as far as public parks that I know of that has a good amount of evergreens that can be used in the winter time. So if you have clients who want to take photos, or if you want to take photos when it's not green outside, with all the other grass and leafy trees, this is the place to go for sure if you still want a nature backdrop, because there are tons and tons of beautiful evergreens in the park that you can use for your backdrop. Okay, let's talk about some of the cons for Pioneers Park. My first one is that Pioneers Park has a lot of events that they host. They have events like cross country meets and stuff like that, but they also have the Pinewood Bowl Amphitheater, which hosts concerts and comedians and things like that. So make sure that you look at their event calendar if you can, because they will actually close off a large part of the park for these events. So you may get there and not be able to even get on the road, which is another reason that I pick the east side of the park, because I find that it's a lot less often closed, the road to get to the east side, than the north entrance of the park. My second con is that if anyone has ever shot at Pioneers Park in peak seasons, so spring and fall, you will understand what I mean when I say there are a ton of photographers and a ton of people getting their photos taken. On the east side, I can't speak for the rest of the park. I think there are too, but it's really become a hotspot for photos lately in the last, I don't know, 3 to 5 years or so. So if you show up, and if you're in this peak season, then there's going to be a lot of people there. So I talk about recommended times based on that after this. And then my last con for Pioneers Park is if you want multiple backdrops, there is going to be a fair amount of walking, and most of that walking is going to be through grass. There is like one paved sidewalk through the east end of the park, but in order to get to some of these locations, you just have to go on the grass to get there. There's no other way. So if you are allergic to grass or really hate it, or you're pushing something that's not going to, travel well on grass, keep that in mind. Okay, let's talk about recommended times to take photos at Pioneers Park. Because what I was talking about of that there are so many other people taking pictures here during peak times, my recommended times would be weekday evenings. And then times of the year would be May. I think the flowering trees are the prettiest in May, and then also October when the fall leaves are the best. And then also, like I said, with the evergreens, you can really go anytime in the winter and get a great backdrop there. So that's one of the unique outdoor spaces, really the only one I'm going to cover outdoors that has just beautiful evergreen scenery in the wintertime. Moving on to the UNL Downtown campus, I'm going to specifically be talking about the area that's just north of the Lead Center. So we'll be hanging around the Sheldon Museum of Art, and then also to the east of that, the Don Love Memorial Library. Those are kind of my favorite areas on the campus to shoot. The pros of this area, one of them is there are a lot of seats, a lot of places to sit that are just natural in the architecture or the scenery, which is great because you don't have to bring a lot of props. And being downtown, you don't want to be lugging around a bunch of those things anyways. So there are lots of places to just naturally sit, and you don't have to worry about bringing your own chairs or seats or anything like that. Another one is that because we have these tall buildings, there's a lot of open shade, which gives you a little more flexibility with the time of day that you can be shooting because you get this great open shade, but it's always just a reliable place that you can go and know that you're not going to have harsh sunlight, and that's a great perk. Second, or thirdly, I guess, is that it's a really great place to have a mix of nature and architecture. I think the best place in town for that. There are several places in the campus that have flowering trees, that have all these beautiful flowers on the ground and these big bushes, and they landscape it very, very well. So you can always have these backdrops that are really just nature, but you can also have backdrops that are just architecture, and then you can have some that are a mix of both. So for those of you who want a little bit of variety, this is a great option. And my last pro is that it's seasonably flexible. So because, obviously you have the nature scenery that's going to die over the winter time, but you're always going to have this architecture as a backdrop that you can use. So if you're wanting to take photos on a time where it's not green outside, this is another good option because the architecture is obviously not going to change over the seasons. Moving on to the cons of the UNL downtown campus. Similar to Pioneers Park, this area hosts a lot of events, specifically the Lead Center, and then the campus does as well sometimes too. So that means that there are going to be parking issues, and you may have to wind up parking in a parking garage farther away. So I'll talk about this a little bit more in my recommended times. My second con is, again, a walking issue. Now this, in comparison to Pioneers Park, is different because there can be a lot of walking from one backdrop to another, but it's essentially all on paved sidewalks. And if I remember right, it's all handicap friendly. So there are ramps to get everywhere. You don't necessarily need to take stairs, although it may be, more traveling to go and find the ramp areas. But yeah, that's different, because if you're okay with walking, but you just don't want to do it on grass, this is a good spot.
So let's talk about recommended times to shoot at the UNL Downtown campus. Weekday evenings, I would say, would be good. Keeping in mind, like we said, that there's lots of events going on around this area. You're going to be less likely to run into them on weekday evenings, although I would always recommend that you check the schedule at the lead center to make sure that you're not running into some big event. Even if you do, the parking is going to be the only issue. The campus itself is not going to be busy, which is nice. Which is another thing. Moving on to recommended times would be, I recommend being there in the summer, just so you're avoiding all the school going on. There's going to be less people on campus, less people walking around in your background, and then less likely for events to be happening on the campus as well. So summer is a good time. And then also, like I said, with it being seasonally flexible, winter is a great time to be here as well, for the architecture. And if you can time that with, winter break with the students, then it's kind of like a win-win as far as not people on the campus, and you still get that pretty backdrop. Okay, my number 3 location is the Capitol building. Again, if you live around Lincoln, you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about and where this is. The biggest pro of the Capitol building is that you can have both indoor and outdoor options using natural light. So the Capitol building has limited hours, which I'll talk about. So you need to make sure you're working within those. But as long as you are, you can be in the Capitol and taking photos in a really beautiful hallway they have with this giant tall windows and natural light. I didn't get any photos inside of that for this example, but I have some actual portraits I've taken in there that you can see. There, also a big pro is that the time of day flexibility. The building outside is huge and tall, and so almost throughout the entire year, you can find one side of the building that's going to have open shade, and you can shoot outside with that. So if you are not able to take photos, early morning or late evening, or even late morning or early evening, the Capitol building is a great choice for you, because you're going to be able to find a place around the outside of the building that you're going to be able to take photos in with open shade. It's just a guarantee, basically. My last pro, kind of goes along with that too, is seasonal flexibility. Kind of like we talked about with UNL Downtown, you have this beautiful architecture, and then there's kind of like these evergreen shrubs around the outside. So it's not going to look quite as good, but it's going to still look better, certainly, than shooting in front of a bunch of dead trees in the wintertime. So you can always be shooting out there in the wintertime. And then also keeping in mind that if you're there at the right time, you can move inside and do some photos that are indoors and outdoors. So you can, warm up a little bit, go inside. And I've done this before. It's cold outside, but we still want to get some outdoor photos. So we go inside and we take some. And then you can also come outside. And there's also an outside area in the center of the Capitol building. There's like a little square rotunda in the middle that you can use to shoot in as well.
Okay, cons for the Capitol building. I hesitate to call this a con, but it's a very important point to make, and a lot of people don't know this. In order to do professional photos at the Capitol building, you have to get pre-approval from the Capitol. It's not as daunting as it sounds. You just basically send them an email, and they'll give you a form to fill out. It's very simple form. You tell them when you're going to be there, and then they just tell you yes or no. I've never gotten a no from them, but maybe on a really busy day or something, it might be possible. Are there people who show up and don't have a pre-approval? Sure. But when you're getting a photo session that you can't, move or redo easily, you don't really want to get kicked out of the Capitol building because you didn't get that form. So make sure you get that ahead of time. My second one is that there are limited, if you're going to just stay outside of the Capitol building, there's kind of a limited variety in what you're going to see in the backdrop, right? We have this big building, obviously, which is going to take up a big part of that. We have kind of those evergreen shrubs around the side. But outside of that, that's pretty much what you're going to get on the outskirts of the Capitol building. So that's a little limited. My last con, I didn't get a picture of this, but even while I was there, and almost every single time I've been to the Capitol, there's construction happening on at least one side of the building, which means that a lot of the windows have like boards over them, or the entry doors have boards over them, or they've got, construction tape or something. You can always find one side of the building that's not affected by this, but if you have to shoot on one specific side, then just make sure that you go ahead and look, even a few days ahead of time or a week ahead of time, that there's not that construction happening on the whole side of that building, because that could ruin your photos.
My recommended times to go to the Capitol building, again, if you want to have that flexibility to move inside or outside, and again, assuming you've gotten this pre-approval, would be Saturday or Sunday. And this is one of the few that I actually recommend you going on the weekend because people aren't working there, and people aren't working around downtown as much on the weekend, so you're not going to run into as much traffic. But weekends from 10 to 5 on Saturday and 1 to 5 on Sunday are the days that the Capitol itself is actually open inside, and you can use that as well. And then as far as time of the year, like I said, year round, honestly, you can be there anytime. It's great to go, if you're going to have, ahead of time that there's rain in the forecast, but this is the only day that you can shoot. And that way you have that option to, just in case the rain lets up, you can be outside for a little bit, but you can also go inside and take those photos inside and not have to worry about the rain or maybe the snow, or something like that. So it really is a great year-round option. Okay, my fourth location is Holmes Lake Park. This is another spot that a lot of people are going to be familiar with if you live in Lincoln. One of the pros of Holmes Lake Park is that it has a lot of different unique settings around the park. There's lots of bridges. I don't know about lots. Well, there's 2 or 3 bridges. There's a beach. It's the only place in town, in Lincoln itself, that you're actually going to have kind of like a little sandy beach to shoot on. A lot of people love to do that. I never actually even have shot down there, but I know that it's a very popular place to take photos. And then it's also got these little peninsulas that kind of stretch out over the water, just these little narrow ones that are made of rocks that you can stand people on and then kind of have a full water backdrop if that's your style, if that's what you're going for. Another pro of Holmes Lake Park is that there is no shortage of parking generally. I mean, assuming you're not getting there on some crazy event that they're hosting, like I think they do like a triathlon kind of a thing there sometimes. So, I mean, obviously avoid the event days, but the vast majority of the time, there's going to be a ton of free parking available for you guys to choose from. So you can usually park very close to wherever you're going to be taking photos in the park.
Okay, let's talk about the cons of Holmes Lake Park. My first one centers around the fact that there is so much water around and often in your backdrop, and the light can be really harsh with both of the glare off of that water and the fact that there's not a whole lot of tall trees or structures or anything to give you some open shade in that area. So the lighting can be really harsh if you're not there kind of like early morning or late evening. Secondly, there are lots of people at Holmes Lake Park, especially in the summertime, especially on the weekends. People are there to fish, to kayak, to picnic. There's going to just be a lot of park goers around. So keep that in mind depending on what time of the day and what time of the year that you're going. And my last one is that there are parking lots everywhere, especially on the north side of the park, which is one of the reasons I don't like to shoot over there. It's really, really hard to find a good, clean backdrop that doesn't have a parking lot in the background.
My recommended times for Holmes Lake Park would be early mornings or late weekday evenings. That will help you kind of avoid the crowds of people who come to the park, just to enjoy the park. And also, it'll help you kind of work around the lighting issues with the harsh light around the water. If you're really close to sunset, really close to sunrise, you're not going to have to run into those issues of that harsh light as much. May to September would probably be my recommended times to be at Holmes Lake Park. There are pretty trees in there in October. However, I find that so many of those trees, like we said, are sitting right around the parking lots. So it's really hard to get photos around these trees, and they're usually very tall, and there's just like one of them at a time. So it's really not a great place to be in the fall. So my recommended times would be May through September. You're probably going to run into a couple flowering trees or plants during the springtime, and then just kind of the general summer look otherwise. Okay, my next location is the Frank Shoemaker Marsh. This may be the one that's the least known from people who live in the Lincoln area, and that's because it's not really marked at all, and it's way on the north side of town. It's actually north of I-80, which is actually one of the pros I want to talk about for the Frank Shoemaker Marsh is that where it's located, it's one of the few areas that I shoot at that's way on the north side of town, and it's really accessible for people coming from like Waverly or Omaha. If you have extended family, someone coming from the interstate, it's a really easy place to go for them instead of having to go all the way into Lincoln. Um, Another pro of the Frank Shoemaker Marsh is that it's less busy. And by that, I mean less busy by people taking photos and by people visiting the park. And that's because it's, like I said, it's not well marked. Not many people know about it. But also, it's just got one little parking lot, and you couldn't hold a ton of people even if you wanted to. So there aren't a lot of people there, and you're not going to have to run into a lot of, people in your backdrops or anything like that. It's got a lot of unique backdrops at Frank Shoemaker, which is another great pro. It's got this really beautiful tall grass that's kind of unique looking compared to other places I've seen around town. It's also got this great path through the woods, and it's a really good open shaded area to take photos there. And then the third unique spot is actually if you go through the trail and come out on the other side, you're going to have a bridge over water, which is kind of in an area with an open grassy field. Sometimes they mow that grass, which is tricky, and I don't ever know when it happens. But when the grass is growing, it's really beautiful. So you have another kind of open grassy area and then the bridge over the water.
Okay, let's talk about the cons of the Frank Shoemaker Marsh. My first one, which I kind of talked about a little bit in the beginning, there's very limited parking at this park. So, I mean, really 6 or 7 cars and this parking lot is full. Now, again, you can park on the road, but it's kind of a dirt road. People drive fast. That's up to you. And if there are that many people there anyways, you're going to have a hard time shooting because of my next con. In that big area with the open shade, really kind of the only shaded area in the whole park, there's that one path that goes through the trees, and that's kind of the only area that has that really consistent open shade. So if another photographer or another family is on that path for whatever reason, you're kind of out of luck and you just have to sit there and wait for them to be done, because if that's the spot that you need, it's the only spot that there is. So that's a big con and something to consider with Frank Shoemaker. My next one is that there are a ton of mosquitoes if you go during, peak mosquito season, which feeds into my recommended times for sure. But just keep that in mind. If you are like me and you're a magnet for mosquitoes, definitely keep this in mind. Bug spray, and then try to avoid those high mosquito times. They call it a marsh for a reason. There are mosquitoes. And then my very last one is the amount of walking. If you want to get like all the way back to that open grassy area with the bridge and the water, there's going to be a fair amount of walking to get there. And it's on like a dirt-ish rocky trail. So really not great for, kind of simple strollers. Certainly not if you're wearing high heels. Keep that in mind. There is a fair amount of walking.
Okay, my recommended times to go to Frank Shoemaker mostly revolve around those things I was talking about and the cons. If you want to avoid running into even one or two other photographers using the space, I would recommend going on the weekdays, either in the morning or the evening. You can pull off photos here. And then to avoid the mosquitoes, I would recommend that you come in either May or like late September to mid-October. That open shaded area with the big trees is really beautiful, like right around the beginning to the middle of October. And then also that tall grass kind of turns a beautiful golden color during that time as well. So those are my recommended times to be at Frank Shoemaker. My next location I'm going to talk about is Wilderness Park. Again, one that people are probably very familiar with. Wilderness Park is giant. The specific area that I'm talking about is a parking lot kind of right west of 14th Street off of Old Cheney. So that's where I've gone the most when I shoot at Wilderness Park. One of the pros of Wilderness Park is that it's very rarely crowded. There might be people there. You're going to have a lot more chance of running into people there who are just hiking around than you will other people taking photos. It's a really great place and kind of the only one around town where you're going to get this kind of woodsy fairy tale look. I mean, it really is just kind of like dense leafy tree woods with these little narrow paths through them. So if you're going for that look, this is the place to go. Because there are so many of these tall trees, there's lots of shade. You're not going to have an issue with harsh light around Wilderness Park because the trees will block that sun so much, and harsh light is just generally not a problem there. And then my last pro is that it's really kind of specific, but there's this one really cool bridge that I love to shoot on, right by that 14th and Old Cheney location. It's just this narrow little kind of janky bridge, but it takes really great pictures if you're there at the right time of day with the right lighting. I would hasten to say that it's not a bridge for little kids because it is not very well guarded on the sides, and it's quite the fall if they decide to go off the edge. So I wouldn't take little kids there, but older kids or maternity or older families, or if you're just going to kind of hold your kid and walk out on the bridge or just stand on the edge of the bridge, any of that would work. The bridge is just a very cool prop and very unique from what I've seen in the Lincoln area.
Okay, let's move to the cons of Wilderness Park. My biggest con with Wilderness Park is the mosquitoes. This is the worst place that I've been to in Lincoln to shoot as far as mosquitoes go. It's even worse than Frank Shoemaker Marsh. And so again, that's going to feed into my recommended times to be there. But yeah, magnet for mosquitoes, me, Wilderness Park, even just to take the shots that I did for this video, I was just like, walking, never stopping, because as soon as I would stop for 2 seconds, there were mosquitoes swarming me. So keep that in mind. The air gets really dense around here because they have those really tall trees. So even if it's like a windy day, you're usually maybe that's a good thing if you don't want the wind, but if you want the wind, this is not a great place to be because those trees are blocking it and it gets pretty stagnant and humid in this area. The backdrop variety is not very variable at Wilderness Park. It is like those tall trees with the path, and outside of the bridge, it pretty much looks the same wherever you go in the park. My last one is kind of relevant, probably not. There have been some issues wondering about the safety of the parking areas. They're very secluded, and I think because of that, people assume that maybe some of the people parking there are not necessarily there for the best intentions. I've never run into this. Like I said, I usually just see, other runners there or hikers. But that is something to think about, at least when you're deciding where to put your purse as you go into your photos. Probably not like right on top of your seat in the driver's seat or something like that.
My recommended times to shoot at Wilderness Park, again, the biggest thing is that you have to avoid those mosquitoes. The mosquitoes are so bad. So kind of like Frank Shoemaker, if you're going to be going in May or late September to mid-October, would help you avoid the mosquitoes the best. And then really any morning or evening works there. It's just never busy enough to have to worry about running into crowds or other photographers or anything like that. So a weekday or a weekend is totally fine. Just morning or evening would be the best time to go. If you want to use that bridge, a cloudy day is great because the bridge really isn't situated great for the light, the way that it runs. So if you find a cloudy day, that bridge is a money spot to shoot. Okay, my next location is the Sunken Gardens. Most people are familiar with the Sunken Gardens. The biggest pro of it is that it is just beautiful. I mean, obviously, it's very carefully curated and planted and well thought out. It's just a beautiful spot to shoot at. And kind of like the UNL Downtown campus, one of the other pros is that there are lots of places to sit. There are stairs, there are ledges. You don't generally have to bring any props or a lot of props for the Sunken Gardens because there are just a lot of places. And another pro is that you can sit on the paths too because they're made out of brick generally, and you don't have to worry about grass. There's really no grass in the entire park other than, kind of on the top. But I mean, you can avoid grass in this entire park if you really hate it or you're allergic to it or you don't want to sit on it or any of that. There's not much grass to be had there. And my last pro, and this is a big one, is that if you have people who, kind of have mobility restrictions or you're wearing heels or people just don't want to walk around long distances, this is a really great place because there are so many different beautiful backdrops really close together. I mean, the Sunken Gardens is actually very small, which feeds into one of the downsides. But as an upside, there's just not a whole lot of walking that you have to do. You can get around the whole park multiple times and not have to walk very much at all. So that's a great pro.
Okay, the cons of the Sunken Gardens. I think looking at the footage that I shot, A lot of this should be explained, but there are a ton of people who go to the Sunken Gardens. If you're there on the weekends in the middle of the day, really any time from, I don't know, probably 9:30 a.m. to close to sunset, it's going to be packed. There's just, and most of the people are not there to have their photos taken professionally, but they are there to take photos of the area, take photos of themselves, to just see everything. And it is very packed, and you are going to have to deal with photoshopping a lot of people out of backdrops if you're there during a busy time. My second con is that the light can be really harsh. In the center of the park, there are no tall structures around to block that light. So keep that in mind when you're deciding when to be there. And that kind of feeds into my recommended times as well. My third is that you have a very limited season that the park is really open. And I'll talk about that in recommended times. My fourth con is that it sounds a little silly, but I mean, just kind of looking at the photos, if you are looking for kind of like a clean, simple backdrop that's not distracting, this is not the place to go. It's so vibrant and so colorful and so busy that it's going to be really hard to find kind of those clean backdrops that aren't going to, take attention potentially away from whatever you're photographing.
My recommended times to be at the Sunken Gardens. So like we talked about with crowds and events and just a lot of people coming here because it's beautiful. Early mornings for sure. And then weekday late evenings to kind of counteract that harsh light. So kind of right after sunrise or right before sunset, you can pull off going on the weekend if you're there for that early morning. It's usually not crowded. But if you're coming on a weekend evening, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I definitely would not recommend because there are going to be a lot of people there and you may not even find a parking space. As far as time of year, mid-June to early October is really the only time that there's anything at the park. So, they plant those flowers, but really not until mid-June or so does it really start to fill in and look great. And then actually sometime generally in October, they go in and they just take everything down. They tear it all out. Sometimes that creeps into the early November, but you just kind of never know when that's going to happen. I think they base it on the frost. But actually, in my opinion, late September to early October is the best time to be at the Sunken Gardens. The scenery is just absolutely incredible during that time. So that would be my number one time to go. Okay, last but certainly not least is the Haymarket and Railyard area. I love this area. I'm not really totally sure where one stops and the other starts, so I'm just going to kind of group them together. I tend to stay on the south end of this area because it's generally less busy and there are a lot of really great buildings around, but I do, wander into the north side as well for things. The Haymarket and the Railyard have the best urban backdrops in Lincoln, so that's one of the big pros. If you really want that kind of cool urbany backdrop, this is obviously the place that you want to go. There are tons of covered, I don't know if patio is the right word, but the area in front of the businesses, tons of covered areas in this spot. So if you're there, either, even in the middle of the day and you want to take photos, there's a ton of open shade in these covered areas where you can still get, this urban backdrop and these outdoor feel. But then also, if it starts to rain or if the weather is a little variable, this is a great place to be because if it is raining, you can stay under these, overhead structures almost the entire time and still get great photos. Similar to Sunken Gardens and UNL Downtown, lots of places to sit. You have lots of stairs, you have lots of, kind of benches, you've just walls to lean against. It's just a great place. You don't really need to bring any props when you come and take photos here. Aside from the shade that you get from these overhanging structures, you're going to get a ton of open shade from the buildings as well, which gives you more flexibility with the time of day that you can take the photos and you don't have to worry about harsh light when you're in the Haymarket generally because you have so many open shaded areas. My last pro is the seasonable flexibility of this area. Kind of like we were talking about the other ones where we have, these big buildings that are going to be your main backdrop. Yes, there are like kind of small little pockets of naturey areas in the Haymarket. For the most part, it's urban, and that's not going to change no matter what season you're in. So there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to seasons in the Haymarket.
Okay, let's talk about the cons of the Haymarket and Railyard area. The first one is important. They have a whole lot of events in the Haymarket and Railyard. They have the Pinnacle Bank Arena, they have the UNL campus, you've got the Lead Center, which isn't too far away, and then any event that happens in the Haymarket itself. So you really have to keep that in mind, and the parking and the crowds can become a big issue. So that feeds into my recommended times, which I'll talk about in a second. My second one is, depending on which direction you're shooting, you may have a lot of cars in the background of your photo, which maybe you don't care about, but if you don't like that look, that's something to think about. Another one is that since it's a place that a lot of people come to like maybe party a little bit, I've seen a lot of broken glass and trash on the grounds, on the sidewalks and stuff in this area. So probably not my best recommended place to take like a 6-month-old to put them in like this little small romper and like set them on the ground, and let them, potentially touch anything that's down there. But for families or older kids who kind of know how to navigate that stuff, it's usually not a big problem.
Finally, talking about my recommended times for the Haymarket and Railyard. Sunday mornings, if you want to be on a weekend, that would really be the only time I would recommend. Saturday, a lot of times they're doing the farmers market or there's some sort of event going on. And you just really want to avoid Saturdays. So Sunday mornings are a really great time to be shooting there. And then also I would say Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday evenings, again, barring any sort of events. That's kind of my caveat for the whole area, is that you really want to check the event schedule of UNL, of the Pinnacle Bank Arena, of anything else, any other business, throwing some sort of event. If there's like a race going on, there's all sorts of events that happen in the Haymarket and the Railyard. So do your homework before you decide to just schedule a big session there that can't be rescheduled any other time. And what we talked about with the seasonal flexibility, you can shoot here year round. I mean, there really is no best or worst time to be there. You got a lot of shade, so if it's a hot day, it's not terribly, painful. If it's really windy day, I mean, it kind of depends, but a lot of times if you can be on the right side of the buildings, it'll block some of that wind. I mean, there's really not a bad time to be shooting in the Haymarket or the Railyard.
Okay, that wraps up my 8 recommended locations around Lincoln. As a second reminder, I do have that PDF to download of the summary of most of the stuff I covered in this video, and you can find that. There's a link in the comments to the blog post, and you can download the PDF there. I'm happy to answer any questions if you guys have any, or other locations around Lincoln. I certainly haven't been to all of them, but if you have any questions about this video, I'm happy to answer them. And best of luck with your future sessions. I hope it goes just even a little bit better just based on this.